General Hospital spoilers tease that the summer heat in Port Charles feels heavier than usual, and not just because of the weather. A storm is gathering behind closed doors, in backrooms and quiet corners, where whispered conversations and exchanged glances carry more weight than public proclamations. Harrison Chase has been carrying the weight of his badge for years, but this time, the burden feels different. It is one thing to enforce the law against strangers or faceless criminals. It is something else entirely to be ordered to put cuffs on someone who is practically a part of his community. The directive came down from higher up, packaged in formality and procedure, but Chase felt it sting as soon as he read the name on the warrant. Gio Palmieri. He knew Gio, not well, but enough to understand the young man wasn't a hardened criminal. This would not be a clean arrest, not in Chase's heart, and not in the fallout it would leave behind. Across town, Emma Scorpio Drake is pacing her bedroom, replaying events in her mind until they lose their shape. She knows she is responsible, maybe not in the eyes of the law, but in every moral and emotional sense. She had pushed Gio into that break-in, convinced him it was the only way to get the evidence she was so sure would make a difference. She had underestimated the risks, both to Joe's freedom and to the web of relationships surrounding them. Now, the decision feels like a stone pressing against her chest, and the thought of him paying for her mistake ignites a fire in her. Emma is not the type to crumble. If anything, her resolve hardens when faced with consequences. Somewhere between guilt and determination, she decides she will not let Gio face this alone, no matter what it takes. Meanwhile, Rocco Falconeri has heard enough to put the pieces together. His loyalty to his friends is unwavering, and Gio has been like a brother to him since their days navigating the complicated social terrain of Port Charles University. When he finds Gio sitting alone on the steps outside Kelly's, staring into the middle distance, Rocco drops down beside him. The conversation is quiet, but every word carries weight. Rocco doesn't sugarcoat the situation. He knows Gio respects honesty, but he also makes it clear that Dante will fight for him. If anyone can pull you out of this, Rocco tells him, it's my dad. He doesn't walk away from people who need him. The promise is both a comfort and a lifeline, something for Gio to hold on to in the days ahead. Michael Corinthos steps into the picture later that afternoon, catching Gio just as he's leaving Kelly's. Michael's approach is different from Rocco's, less about reassurances and more about strategy. He leans in, lowering his voice so the passing crowd can't hear. Sonny will cover whatever needs to be covered, he says. Lawyers, bail, anything. You won't go through this without help. Michael has seen enough of the justice system to know that money and influence can tip the scales, and he has both at his disposal. But he also sees something else in Gio: youth, potential, the possibility of a future that doesn't end in a criminal record. That is worth protecting at all costs. On the other side of town, the tension is manifesting differently. Dante Falconeri and Brooke Lynn Quartermain are huddled in a corner booth at the Metro Court, the table cluttered with coffee cups and hastily scribbled notes. They are not just strategizing for Joe's defense, they are navigating the fragile balance between personal loyalty and professional duty. Dante knows that Chase will have to follow the order, just as he would if the roles were reversed, but the thought of his friend arresting a young man who might be innocent gnaws at him. Brooke Lynn, never one to hold back her opinions, makes it clear she isn't happy about Chase being put in this position. He's doing his job, Dante reminds her, though his tone suggests he's trying to convince himself as much as her. Still, they keep talking, circling ideas, searching for some loophole or angle that might avert the inevitable. Chase, in the meantime, is replaying his own internal argument. He has spoken to the DA's office, to his captain, even to himself in the mirror, but none of it changes the outcome. Orders are orders, and the consequences for defying them could end his career. Yet the image of Gio in cuffs keeps intruding on his thoughts, paired with the knowledge that this will shatter trust, not just with Gio, but with Dante, Rocco, Michael, people he respects. He finds himself lingering outside the station longer than necessary, as though delaying his return will somehow delay the moment he has to act. Emma's determination takes shape into a plan. She starts asking questions, reaching out to contacts she knows through her parents and their long history in Port Charles. She's careful not to reveal too much, but she probes for anything that could weaken the case against Gio, technicalities, procedural errors, even personal favors. The process is exhausting, but it gives her purpose, a way to channel her guilt into something tangible. Late one evening, she sits on her bed with her laptop open, reading over statutes and case law she barely understands. She doesn't know if she can find anything useful, but she refuses to sit by and do nothing. Michael keeps his promise and begins moving the necessary pieces into place. He reaches out to Sunny, who listens silently before nodding once in agreement. "We'll handle it," Sunny says, the unspoken implication being that he will move mountains, bend rules, and apply pressure wherever needed. Sunny's influence in Port Charles is a double-edged sword, capable of delivering both salvation and destruction, but in this case, Michael knows it is their best chance. Rocco finds himself playing the role of morale officer, checking in with Gio, making sure he eats, reminding him of the people who are in his corner. Gio appreciates it more than he says out loud. The pressure is building, and every hour feels heavier than the last, but knowing he's not alone makes the weight a little easier to bear. Dante and Brooke Lynn's meeting at the Metro Court stretches late into the evening, spilling into a second round of coffee and then into silence as both of them run out of new ideas. Finally, Dante pushes his notes aside. "If we can't stop it from happening," he says, "then we have to be ready for what comes after." Brooke Lynn nods reluctantly, already thinking about the next steps: lawyers, public statements, damage control. Neither of them likes the thought of bracing for impact, but the reality is closing in on them. By the time the sun rises over Port Charles the next morning, the pieces are in place. Chase has his orders. Gio knows what's coming, even if he's not ready for it. Emma is still chasing threads of hope. Rocco and Michael stand ready to intervene the moment they can. Dante and Brooke Lynn have their strategy mapped out, as much as it can be without knowing how messy the arrest will be. And Sunny, silent, calculating, is waiting for the exact moment to step in. The air feels charged, like the seconds before a storm breaks. Everyone knows the arrest will be a turning point. No one knows what the fallout will look like. The morning was quiet, almost deceptively so, as Chase walked into the precinct with the weight of his orders hanging over him. Every step toward his desk felt heavier than the last, each movement tethered to the knowledge that by the end of the day, he would put Gio Palmieri in handcuffs. The paperwork was already on his desk, the warrant crisp and cold, its language clinical and stripped of emotion. It made no mention of friendships, loyalty, or the complicated bonds of Port Charles life. Chase knew the law didn't care about those things, but he did. Across town, Gio sat at Kelly's with a mug of coffee he barely touched. His thoughts drifted, not to the arrest itself, he had already accepted that, but to what came after. Would PCU even let him finish the semester? Would the people he cared about still look at him the same way? He tried to shake the thoughts away, focusing instead on Rocco's words from the night before. "Dante will find a way." Gio wanted to believe it, even if believing felt like walking a tightrope over a chasm. Emma was not one to sit and watch events unfold without intervention. She had spent most of the night combing through everything she could find on break-in charges, hoping for a loophole. By the time she met Rocco in the park that morning, she had a plan that was more desperation than strategy. If she could get someone to admit Gio hadn't been acting alone, or better yet, that she had pushed him into it, maybe the charges could be softened or shifted entirely. Rocco listened in silence, his jaw tightening as she spoke. He admired her determination, but he also knew the legal system didn't bend easily, not even for someone with Emma's resolve. Michael, meanwhile, was already in motion. The attorney Sunny had on retainer was briefed, the bail money was set aside, and arrangements for a rapid response were in place. Michael believed in acting before the first blow landed. He knew the arrest would be public, and in Port Charles, public meant amplified, rumors, judgment, and the kind of social fallout that could stick to someone for life. Keeping Joe's head above water meant moving fast and staying one step ahead of the narrative. Dante stood in his office, staring at the phone as though willing it to ring with some miraculous change of orders. Brooke Lynn was at his side, her voice steady but tinged with frustration. If Chase has to do it, we can't stop that, she said. But we can control what happens afterward. They went over their plan again, coordinate with Michael, keep Sonny informed, and make sure Gio had legal representation before the ink on the arrest report was dry. Dante's mind kept returning to Chase. He knew this was eating at his friend, knew the position it put him in, but duty had a way of steamrolling personal feelings. When Chase finally left the precinct with 2 other officers, the streets seemed unnaturally still. The walk to Joe's apartment wasn't long, but every step felt like it stretched the distance. By the time they arrived, Gio was already waiting outside. He didn't run, didn't argue. He simply looked Chase in the eye and nodded once, as if to say, "Let's get this over with." The quiet made it worse. Chase read him his rights, the words tasting like ash, and the click of the cuffs echoed louder than it should have. The arrest drew eyes instantly. A neighbor paused on her porch, phone in hand, recording. 2 teenagers whispered from across the street. Within minutes, the footage would hit social media, and within the hour, half of Port Charles would know Gio Palmieri had been taken in by Harrison Chase. Emma arrived just in time to see the patrol car pull away, her heart pounding with a mix of anger and fear. She wanted to run after them, to demand they stop, but Rocco's hand on her arm held her back. "We can't help him like this," he said, his voice low. Back at the station, Michael was already waiting with the attorney. The booking process was routine but suffocating, each step adding to the weight on Joe's shoulders. Fingerprints, photographs, paperwork. None of it seemed real. Chase stayed professional, but he avoided meeting Joe's eyes whenever possible. He didn't want Gio to see the conflict there, didn't want him to know just how much this was tearing at him. The meeting in the conference room afterward was tense. Dante, Brooke Lynn, Michael, and the attorney sat around the table while Sonny remained a silent presence at the end, watching, listening. "We can get him out on bail today," the attorney said, "but the charges are serious. Breaking and entering, property damage, there's talk of adding intent to commit theft." Emma, who had slipped into the meeting despite Dante's protests, leaned forward. "He didn't break in to steal. He was trying to help me. If anyone's guilty, it's me." The attorney's gaze softened, but his tone stayed firm. "Even if that's true, the evidence points to him. We'll work on building the case, but we need to be smart." Rocco spoke up then, his voice steady. "What about the lab? Can we prove there was no intent to damage anything?" Michael nodded. "That's where we start. If we can show he wasn't there to cause harm, we can chip away at this." Brooke Lynn added, "And we get ahead of the rumors. We make it clear Joe's not some career criminal, he's a student, a friend, someone who got caught in the wrong place at the wrong time." Outside the conference room, Chase sat at his desk, filling out the necessary reports. He could hear the muffled voices through the glass, but he didn't join them. His role in this was over, at least officially. Unofficially, he knew he was still part of the mess. Arresting Gio might have been his job, but it didn't feel like justice. By evening, Gio was released on bail. Emma was the first to reach him, wrapping her arms around him before he could speak. Rocco followed, clapping him on the shoulder, and Michael handed him a manila envelope. "Everything you need to know about the next steps," Michael said. "Read it. Memorize it. And don't talk to anyone about the case without the lawyer present." The walk out of the station felt surreal. The sky was streaked with gold and pink, but the air carried the weight of what was still ahead. The arrest was only the beginning. Charges, hearings, and the constant hum of public opinion waited just around the corner. Every person involved, Emma, Rocco, Michael, Dante, Brooke Lynn, Chase, knew the hardest battles were still to come. And somewhere in the shadows of Port Charles, Sonny was already moving pieces into place, his version of justice quietly unfolding. The days ahead would test friendships, push loyalties to their breaking point, and force each of them to decide how far they were willing to go to protect someone they believed in. The storm had broken, but the flood was only beginning. Night had settled over Port Charles, but none of them could find rest. Joe's release on bail had been a temporary reprieve, yet the looming trial hung over them like a thundercloud refusing to break. The media had already latched onto the story, twisting the details into something sharper, something dangerous. Headlines painted Gio as reckless, a thrill-seeker who thought himself above the law. For the people who knew him, those words stung almost as much as the charges themselves. Emma was relentless. She refused to watch from the sidelines as Joe's name was dragged through the mud. She spent hours piecing together her own version of the events, determined to prove that Gio had acted under her urging and that his actions were meant to help, not harm. But every conversation with the attorney reminded her that the legal system valued evidence over sentiment. Intent matters, he told her, but only if we can prove it. That meant digging for security footage, finding credible witnesses, and challenging the lab's account of the so-called break-in. Rocco became Joe's shadow, always close enough to intercept any whispers or stares. He knew the community's tendency to judge first and learn the truth later, and he wasn't going to let Gio stand alone in that scrutiny. More than once, he intercepted comments in Kelly's or along the pier, setting the record straight with a calm but firm tone. He told anyone who'd listen that Dante was working every angle, that Michael was covering the legal ground, that this was not the end of the story. Michael had shifted into a different mode, precise, calculating, quietly forceful. His focus was on dismantling the prosecution's narrative before it even reached the courtroom. He and the attorney dug deep into the lab's security protocols, looking for gaps or irregularities. If they could show the lab had left itself open to entry, the severity of the charges might be reduced. Michael's phone was never silent, his days filled with quiet conversations that always seemed to end with a subtle shift in Joe's favor. Dante and Brooke Lynn had formed a silent pact. Their strategy meetings became nightly rituals, conducted over takeout containers and late-night coffee. They examined every scenario, every possible witness, every angle that could be used to frame Joe's actions as misguided but not criminal. Brooke Lynn's sharp instincts cut through the noise, finding pressure points in the prosecution's case that Dante could quietly exploit through back channels. She knew how to navigate politics, and Dante knew how to navigate the law. Together, they were a quiet force, unseen but undeniably present. Chase kept his distance from the group, though he followed every development. He didn't insert himself into the strategy sessions, but he made sure that no procedural misstep during the arrest could be used against Gio. It was the only way he knew to balance the badge on his chest with the loyalty in his heart. He carried the memory of Joe's quiet compliance like a stone in his pocket, something he felt every time his thoughts drifted to that day. The preliminary hearing arrived sooner than they'd hoped. The courtroom was small, packed with reporters and onlookers. Gio sat at the defense table, his posture straight, his expression calm, though Emma could see the tension in his hands. Michael sat behind him with Dante and Brooke Lynn, the three of them a solid wall of support. Rocco and Emma were close enough to be seen, a silent reminder that Gio wasn't alone. The prosecution painted a picture of a young man who had crossed a line deliberately, who had forced entry into a facility he had no business entering. But when the defense presented its opening, the narrative shifted. The attorney emphasized Joe's clean record, his academic achievements, and the absence of any theft or vandalism. He hinted at extenuating circumstances without revealing too much, planting seeds of doubt in the judge's mind. It was Emma's statement that broke the rhythm of the morning. She spoke not as a defendant or a co-conspirator, but as someone who had asked a friend for help. She described the urgency of her request, the trust she had in Gio, and the belief that what they were doing was necessary. While the judge cautioned her that intent would be examined carefully, her words landed heavily in the room. Even the prosecutor seemed to weigh them more seriously than expected. When the hearing adjourned, the air outside the courthouse felt lighter, but only slightly. The judge had agreed to a full trial, but bail remained in place. It was a small win in a much larger war. Over the following weeks, the case became a slow-moving chess match. Every day brought new challenges, a witness who suddenly backed out, a piece of evidence that seemed damning until Michael found a way to reinterpret it, an article in the paper that painted Gio in a harsher light. Sonny's quiet influence kept some of the more vicious voices at bay, though he never stepped into the spotlight. His role was in the shadows, smoothing paths no one else could touch. As the trial date approached, Gio found himself reflecting on the strange mix of loyalty and tension that had formed around him. Emma's tireless energy, Rocco's unwavering presence, Michael's calculated moves, Dante and Brooklyn's relentless strategy, Chase's silent watch, all of it formed a net that kept him from falling completely. But he also saw how much each of them was giving up to protect him. The trial itself stretched for days. Witnesses testified, lawyers sparred, and the judge maintained an unyielding poker face. The most pivotal moment came when a piece of lab security footage surfaced, one that showed Gio entering the facility but hesitating, clearly looking over his shoulder as if expecting someone else. It corroborated Emma's account and weakened the prosecution's claim of deliberate, solo action. In closing arguments, the prosecution pushed for a conviction on lesser charges, acknowledging that their original case had been weakened. The defense seized on that shift, framing it as proof that Joe's actions, while misguided, were not criminally malicious. The verdict came on a gray afternoon. The courtroom was silent as the foreperson read it aloud, not guilty on the most serious charges, guilty only of trespassing. The sentence was a fine and community service, no jail time, no criminal record beyond the misdemeanor. Relief swept through the defense table like a breaking wave. Emma gripped Joe's hand, Rocco let out a breath he'd been holding for weeks, and Michael's shoulders finally eased. Outside, reporters clamored for statements, but Gio kept his words simple. "I'm grateful to the people who stood by me. I'm going to make this right." It wasn't dramatic, but it was honest, and in Port Charles, honesty carried its own weight. That night, they gathered quietly, no grand celebration, just a meal shared among friends and allies who had fought the storm together. Chase showed up late, lingering by the doorway before joining them. When Gio caught his eye, there was no need for words. They both understood what it had cost to stand where they were now. In the end, the arrest had changed more than Joe's record, it had strengthened bonds, reshaped trust, and reminded them all that in Port Charles, the lines between law, loyalty, and love were never as clear as they seemed. And while the chaos had settled for now, everyone knew it was only a matter of time before another storm rolled in. That was the way of things here, and they were ready.